Hi, this is Miss Wright, and I am going to review the major characters, settings, and concepts related to Stage 1. You can use this to help you prepare for our test on Stage 1 and also to make sure that you have taken notes on all of these items. Okay, so I'm going to start with the forge, which is where the blacksmith lives. This is Joe's home. It's divided into two parts. Part is residence, and the other part is where he works. This is where Pip lives. Pip is the protagonist of this novel, and we meet Pip when he is first in the churchyard, standing before the tombstone of his mother and father, trying to eke out some understanding of what kind of people they were based on the formation of the letters in their names. And we get this terrible sense of isolation and lack of knowledge about who his parents were. So we're pretty sure he's never met them. Um, we have Mrs. Joe, who is also called Mother Gargery, and I would definitely say she is one of Pip's antagonists in the story, although if we read carefully, we find that she's a much more complicated character than first appears. When we initially meet her, she is wielding something called the tickler, which is a piece of bamboo. They call it a waxed piece of cane, and she's about to uh, use it on Pip for having stayed out too late and not letting them know where he is. And when she finds out that he's been in the churchyard, she isn't at all sympathetic to the fact that this little boy is very curious about his mom and his dad and the siblings who have passed away before him. Uh, the next character would be Joe. Joe is the blacksmith, and Joe is this magnificent character who, as the story progresses, will become an essential and very, very important character throughout the novel in terms of Pip's moral development and helping Pip to see the error of his ways without necessarily uh, doing it in a severe way, but Pip, through Joe and looking at Joe's character, often sees where he has gone wrong. During stage one, we find out about Joe's father and mother, and we find out why Joe, who is supposed to be a very strong man, he would have to be a blacksmith, pounding on molten iron throughout the day. He would be very muscular, and yet with his wife, he seems very weak and very docile. And it's when he reflects on the relationship between his mother and his father, and we find out that he's come from a abusive household where his father was an alcoholic. His father used to beat his mother. His father used to beat him when he was very small, younger than 10 years old, and they would often have to flee the house in order to survive. And because of the societal norms at that time, the father could find out where they were and demand that they return home, and then eventually he would start the abuse all over again. So it's a very compelling story, and we find out through that story why Joe refuses to lift a finger against his wife, who is very abusive, much like his father. And it's because he says he would rather go wrong by being too gentle than to go wrong by being too violent and end up being just like his father. So uh, that was chapter 7, and if you haven't really spent time with chapter 7, it's something you might want to go back and do. Uncle Pumblechook is actually Joe's uncle, but in the story, he seems to be much more in alliance with Mrs. Joe. They seem to be of one mind. So Uncle Pumblechook is one of the guests at the Christmas dinner, along with Mr. Wopsle and the Hubbles. And these people, Pip sees them as adversaries in that they are always admonishing him to be grateful. They are always taking Mrs. Joe's side and saying what a good job she's doing raising him, and they don't seem to notice any of the abuse that Pip has to endure. Although he also does say that Mrs. Joe behaves differently when other people are around as opposed to when she is at home alone with Joe and Pip. So there's a certain amount of hypocrisy, and the criticism of hypocrisy is one of the themes or one of the big ideas that you will see manifest itself throughout this novel. Pip is very um, anti hypocrisy as well, he should be, but he tends to point it out in others quite often. It also will become something that he has to overcome, and it's never as easy to see your own hypocrisy as it is to see hypocrisy in others. Okay, tar water was one of the things that Pip touched when he was trying to procure things for the convict in the churchyard. And he steals some brandy for the convict, but he has to make it look like none of the brandy is missing. He replaces the brandy with tar water, and eventually it's Mr. Pumblechook or Uncle Pumblechook who drinks that tar water, and it's quite a comic scene as he's choking and sputtering and gasping, thinking that he was about to drink brandy, only to find out he's drinking this foul tasting tonic that Pip had been made to drink whenever his sister thought he might be ill. Apprenticeship is the system that Pip enters into when he becomes uh, a worker for Joe. He is like a novice worker, someone who's just learning the trade of being a blacksmith, and as a novice, he would be an apprentice to Joe. This is not a casual relationship. This is a formal relationship because they actually had to sign legal documents which were called indentures. And the indentures were filed in the court. They had to go to the court to register the papers. So this is a binding contract between two people that says that Pip will work for Joe for a certain amount of years and learn the trade of being a blacksmith. Initially, Pip looked forward to working side by side with Joe, but once he meets Mrs. Havisham or Miss Havisham and Estella, and they start to work on his psyche, and he starts to feel bad about himself and to feel lower class, he has second thoughts about becoming the apprentice to Joe. And when it finally does happen, it is a very unhappy state that he's in. And that was when we looked at chapter 14 and we did the close examination of chapter 14. So if you need to go back there, it's a very telling chapter as to how Pip feels about spending the rest of his life as a blacksmith. Something that he had looked forward to now becomes uh, like a chain around his neck, like a great burden. Okay, I am going to move on here. The last person in this section called the Forge is Dolch Orlick, who was a journeyman that worked for Joe. And a journeyman would be someone who was no longer an apprentice. Working for the blacksmith, he would have had many years, several years of experience, and he would know the trade. He could even go on his own and start working as a blacksmith, but Orlick is still there. And since he's not the head man, he's like the second level, then he's referred to as a journeyman. Orlick's characterization is truly comic, but it's also in some ways sinister. He's almost like a cartoon character, the way he slouches around and hides behind things and is always seems to be in competition with Pip, even though he would be maybe 10 years older than Pip, because Pip is just a teenager at this point in the story when he becomes the apprentice, and Orlick would have been in his early 20s. So there should be a lot of years between them, but Orlick shows his immaturity by being in constant competition with Pip. For example, when Pip wants to take a half day off, he is confronted by Orlick, who decides he must also have a half day off. Okay, I'm going to talk about the marshes. The marshes are the wetlands. They are wetlands that are by the coast. Kent would have a coastline, and out on the marshes is the church. The church is near the marshes, and this is where Pip meets convict number one, who he refers to as my convict. The convict grabs him, literally turns him upside down, empties his pocket, and eventually requests that Pip bring him food, which is victuals. He pronounces it wittles, one, because he's not educated, and two, because he doesn't have a lot of teeth, so he slurs his words. He wants a file, which is a piece of metal that can cut through chains. He wants possibly something to drink. Pip will bring him brandy. He also threatens Pip that if he doesn't do what he's told, he will have another convict who is hidden away stalk him and eat out his liver. And so this little boy of 7 years old uh, feels threatened, and rightfully so, feels threatened that there's someone who's watching him and lurking. And when he returns with the food and the file and actually runs into a convict, he believes that it must have been real. Now, we as readers should realize that when the convict number one first talked about another person with him, he was lying. He was making it up just to coerce Pip into doing what he wants. When Pip runs into a true convict number two, the first convict is actually surprised to hear that someone else is out there in the marshes. And that's how we know he has been lying. Okay, Battery is kind of like a fort-like area where they would have guns to sound if England were being invaded. And you're like, well, if you know your English history, England had been invaded by the French, and they had many wars. So the battery on the coastline to sound an alarm would not have been unusual. In this part of the book, it's used to sound the escape of convicts. The churchyard is where Pip finds his parents' tombstone. Philip and Georgiana are his parents. There are 5 other brothers who are named in chapter 1, and we realize that this book is starting with a great deal of loss for the protagonist. The hulks are prison ships that are moored out along the coast, kind of like islands unto themselves, and our convicts that we meet would have had to have jumped overboard and swam for the coast. They would be freezing, they would be wet and cold and shivering. And that's what we see at the beginning of this story in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And the last thing I'm going to do are the soldiers The soldiers come to the Christmas dinner. They surprise Pip, who is full of guilt, thinking that he's about to be arrested. But what they really want to do is to have Joe fix the handcuffs.